Welcome back, everyone. I'm Jordan Giesige, and this is The Limiting Factor. Nearly 5 years ago now, Tesla's battery research partner, Professor Jeff Dahn, published a research paper that claimed it was now possible to build a high-energy density EV battery pack with off-the-shelf materials that would last up to 1 million miles in real-world conditions. I followed up on that research in my own videos and confirmed that indeed, the technology was ready for commercialization. And as a result, I expected that within a couple of years, Tesla would start using million-mile batteries in their vehicles. However, 5 years later, the batteries in Tesla's vehicles last 300,000 to 400,000 miles instead of 1 million. So the question is, what happened to the million-mile battery? Today, I'm going to walk you through the answer to that by looking at it from a technical perspective, by looking at comments from the team at Tesla, and by looking at the broader competitive landscape. In short, battery makers appear to be prioritizing specs like cost, charging speed, and supply chain security over cycle life, and there are better options such as LFP batteries for use cases that require high cycle life. Before we begin, a special thanks to my Patreon supporters, YouTube members, and Twitter subscribers, as well as Rebellionaire.com. They specialize in helping investors manage concentrated positions. Rebellionaire can help with covered calls, risk management, and creating a money master plan from your financial first principles. Let's start by looking at what the million-mile battery actually is. In 2019, Jeff Dahn published a paper showing that by using the best materials on the market, nickel-based lithium-ion batteries are capable of achieving very high cycle lives. That is, the number of times a battery cell can be charged and discharged before it fails. Typically, at that time, it was considered a great result if a nickel-based lithium-ion battery lasted around 1,000 cycles. And what Jeff Dahn was able to show in his research was that could easily be pushed to 4,000 to 5,000 cycles with the right materials. 4,000 to 5,000 cycles in a vehicle with 250 miles of range would mean an EV battery that would last 1 million miles, which is of course how the million-mile battery got its name. So how did Jeff Dahn's lab increase the cycle life by more than 4 to 5 times? There were 3 key materials involved. The first was single crystal cathode material. Generally, lithium-ion batteries use polycrystal cathode particles, where hundreds or thousands of small primary crystals form a large secondary particle. That causes issues with cycle life because when a battery charges and discharges, the primary crystals expand and contract against each other, crack the secondary particle, and react with the electrolyte, which reduces cycle life. With a single crystal cathode particle, the crystals aren't part of a larger conglomerate and are free to expand and contract without grinding against other crystals, and therefore don't degrade as quickly. The second material was artificial graphite, which in my view was helpful but not critical to the high cycle life achieved with the million-mile battery. Artificial, also known as synthetic graphite, which is made in factories, tends to offer longer cycle life than natural graphite that comes from mines. But that's not always the case. So for the purposes of this video, we can ignore the artificial graphite as a key requirement for the million-mile battery. The third material was electrolyte additives. When a battery is cycled for the first time, additives react with the surface of the anode to form a protective film, called a solid electrolyte interface, or SEI. That SEI protects the anode from continuing to react with the lithium in the electrolyte, which the battery needs to charge and discharge. So the SEI increases the cycle life of the battery. Some additives create an SEI layer that's significantly better at protecting the anode from those reactions, which makes the battery last even longer. That occurs at very low percentages as a proportion of the electrolyte, such as, give or take, around 1% of the weight of the electrolyte. What all this means is that, overall, making a million-mile battery at a conceptual level is pretty straightforward. So why hasn't it happened yet? Why are the batteries in a Tesla vehicle lasting around 300,000 to 400,000 miles rather than 2 to 3 times that? Let's start with the cathode. My understanding is that single crystal cathode material tends to be about 5% more expensive than polycrystal cathode material because, for example, its production process process can require 2 heating steps instead of 1, which adds cost. However, with enough production scale, I suspect the cost of single crystal cathode material would probably reach close to cost parity with polycrystal cathode material. That's because both poly and single crystal cathode use the same raw material inputs for production, and the learning curve involved with scaling always drives product cost towards materials cost. The next issue with the cathode is more of a first principles physics problem. If you look closely at this image, you can see that the single crystal cathode particles are only about 1 to 2 microns across. That's as opposed to a polycrystal cathode particle, which is about an order of magnitude larger. The smaller particle size of single crystal cathode creates 2 issues. First, in order for electricity to conduct between the cathode particles and have low resistance, it has to be coated with highly conductive carbon black powder. Smaller particles means a higher ratio of surface area to volume, which means higher costs and lower energy density due to a higher proportion of inactive material. I do expect that could be somewhat resolved with single-walled carbon nanotubes, which are much more conductive than carbon black and getting cheaper. But there would still be a fundamental cost disadvantage for single crystal cathode particles compared to larger polycrystal cathode particles. Second, which is speculation on my part, polycrystal cathode particles are somewhat porous, which allows them to become saturated with liquid electrolyte. That creates pathways for lithium ions deep into the cathode particle, so even a large particle allows for a relatively low resistance flow of ions into and out of the cathode crystals at the center of the particle. With a single crystal cathode particle, it's a monolithic crystal. And so even if it was possible to grow the crystals larger, the charge and discharge rate might be slower because the lithium ions might encounter more resistance when trying to reach the core of the crystal. That's because, among other things, the cathode is made of solid 2-dimensional sheets rather than a flowable 3-dimensional liquid. If that's all correct, I don't know of an engineering solution to that because the ionic resistance of larger crystals would very much be a first principles physics problem. If I'm incorrect here and you have some insights on crystal size and ionic resistance for poly and single crystal cathodes, let me know in the comments below. Now that we've covered the challenges with the cathode for the million-mile battery, let's take a look at the electrolyte. Both Jeff Dahn and Tesla employees have said that some of the additives that can dramatically increase the cycle life of batteries are IP locked, or intellectual property locked. That means there are players in the market that have a monopoly on those additives, which in turn means that if a battery manufacturer runs into a supply issue with those additives, there's no fallback source in the battery supply chain. And, of course, because additives can dramatically improve cycle life and the suppliers have a monopoly on them, they tend to charge large premiums for the additives. In short, high-performing additives are high risk and high cost, and most battery manufacturers aren't willing to accept the additional risk in their supply chain, nor the additional cost. That's because currently, 5 years on from the million-mile battery paper, commercially available nickel-based lithium-ion batteries are usually achieving at least 1,200 cycles. On a vehicle with 300 miles of range, which is now common, after factoring in capacity loss, that's roughly 300,000 miles over the life of the vehicle, which is more than enough for most vehicle buyers. That makes higher cycle life low priority. That's as opposed to cost, which is almost always one of the top priorities for vehicle buyers. With that said, as I pointed out in my PDO patent video, Tesla and Jeff Dahn still do appear to be developing additives that improve cycle life. That is, they're trying to commercialize their own in-house alternatives to the IP-locked additives. If those additives can be produced at no additional cost or lower cost than the IP-locked additives, then there's no reason not to use them in battery cells. There's no way to know how that commercialization process is going, but it's clearly a goal that they have their sights set on. So for now, it's a matter of wait and see. If they do succeed, it would open the door to dramatic improvements in cycle life for Tesla batteries. How much of an improvement would be a product-level question based on cost and performance trade-offs, but it appears that a doubling of battery life would easily be on the table. But as with all things batteries, I'm not holding my breath, and overall, I expect incremental increases in cycle life over time. On that note, some people might point out that although using a more expensive single crystal cathode and IP-locked additives might cost more from a cost per kilowatt-hour perspective, it would result in much higher cycle life, meaning more value in terms of cost per kilowatt-hour per cycle. That's definitely true, but again, it comes down to the preferences of the average consumer, and cost per kilowatt-hour per cycle isn't a factor. As long as their EV lasts as long as an internal combustion vehicle, they're happy, and their main concern is factors like cost and charge rate. So those specs get disproportionate attention by automakers. Interestingly, the same dynamic that plays out for cycle life also plays out for charging speed. Tesla could increase the charging speed of their vehicles, but it would come at the expense of specs like cost and cycle life. Given that charging speed of Tesla vehicles is generally competitive, that's not a worthwhile trade-off. I'll cover the options for increasing the charge rate of EVs more thoroughly when I do a video on CATL's Shanxing battery. Much like the million-mile battery showcased how using a combination of the best technologies on the market could improve cycle life, my view is that Shanxing is doing the same for charging speed. Getting back on track on the topic of cost per kilowatt-hour per cycle, what about grid storage? Isn't cost per kilowatt-hour per cycle the key metric for that use case? Yes, it is the key metric, but in my view, the grid storage market is going to be cornered by LFP batteries and then potentially down the road by sodium-ion batteries. That's because LFP batteries are much cheaper than nickel-based lithium-ion batteries, and there are cells on the market now that offer up to 12,000 cycles of use before reaching end of life. LFP batteries are lower energy density than high-nickel batteries, but that's not the primary requirement for grid storage like it is for EVs. So overall, even if Tesla was able to radically increase the cycle life of nickel-based lithium-ion batteries without increasing their price, they can't compete with LFP for grid storage because LFP batteries cost more than 20% less, they're easier to scale because they use more abundant materials, and have fundamentally better cycle life. If you'd like to know more about LFP batteries, watch my LFP science video. In summary, the million-mile battery is one of the first things that I covered on this channel 4 years ago. At that time, I didn't see any showstoppers from a technology standpoint. However, the limiting factor for the adoption of a new technology can often be something mundane or unexpected. The million-mile battery is a good example of that. Although all the technology was there on the market 5 years ago to manufacture high-nickel million-mile batteries, there were 3 critical issues. First, the single crystal cathode would have traded a slight reduction in energy density and a slight increase in cost for a large increase in cycle life. But energy density and cost are far more important to consumers. Second, the electrolyte additives needed to make the million-mile battery work tend to be IP-locked, which makes them more expensive and more risky to build a supply chain around. Third, since the million-mile battery paper was published, LFP batteries have gone from strength to strength, with lower costs, higher cycle life, greater scalability and availability, and other less talked about factors like improved hardware and software controls to accommodate their flat voltage profile. What all that means is that in use cases where long cycle life is needed, LFP batteries are usually the best option. With all that said, I do expect the cycle life of nickel-based lithium-ion batteries to continue to increase over time as a result of Jeff Dahn's research into better electrolyte formulations. But the speed that happens will be dependent on when and if Tesla commercializes in-house additives, and how nicely those additives play with electrolyte formulations that increase charging speed. If you enjoyed this video, please consider supporting the channel by using the links in the description. Also, consider following me on X. I often use X as a testbed for sharing ideas, and X subscribers, like my Patreon supporters, generally get access to my videos a week early. On that note, a special thanks to my YouTube members, X subscribers, and all the other patrons listed in the credits. I appreciate all of your support, and thanks for tuning in.